All right, everyone, welcome back to Last Week in D.C. Coming to you from the amazing Frontier House, the startup base of operations in Washington, D.C. So big week in D.C., last week in D.C. Not really a lot going on, but big things going on. We obviously had the President's State of the Union. Now, before I get into the President's State of the Union, let me just say very clearly, you cannot do business with the federal government without being aware of politics. I'm not saying you need to be involved in politics. I'm not saying you need to pick a side. I'm not saying that you have to have political beliefs. And if you do, and even if they're strongly held political beliefs, keep in mind that if you're doing business with the federal government, your party is not red, it's not blue, it is green. Keep that in mind. So as we get into the State of the Union, if you watched the State of the Union, good, you should. It's important. It's things that are going on in the federal government. If you watched it and you were cheering for one side of the aisle, good for you. I hope you got everything you wanted out of it or didn't, to whatever degree that makes sense for you. What the important part is we pull out from the president's message where the signals and indicators are for this fiscal year, the remaining fiscal years within the control of the president. And I say that very specifically. It's obviously when we deal with working with the federal government, it's not clean. It's not clear as day. On the Hill, we have this term and it's called regular order. Regular order is like a fantasy world where everything works right according to the schedule, right? So the president's budget by law is supposed to be delivered to Congress in the first week of February, and we still don't have the president's budget. So regular order would assume that things are happening according to schedule, like fiscal years starting on October 1st of the preceding year, which they don't because we've been in a continuing resolution for, I don't know, something like 18 of the last 19 years. That said, but you do need to be aware of what's going on with the federal government and in the tenure of the remainder of the Trump administration. So what we have is right now, the president is getting ready to deliver the fiscal year 27 budget to Congress. That means we will have a congressional budgeting year, congressional appropriations year that is in swing right now for the fiscal year of 27. He will deliver a 28 budget and he will deliver a 29 budget. That 29 president's budget request will likely be enacted on the other side of a presidential election because we don't start the fiscal year on time, like ever. So that being said, we have the execution year of 28. We have the execution year of 27. We have the execution year of 28. We're going to see a president's budget for 29, but the execution of that 29 budget is highly dependent on the outcome of the next presidential election. So we're really talking about the executable dollars for fiscal 26, where we're sitting right now, the incoming 27, and the future 28. As we listen to the president's speech as Team Green, not red or blue, we're looking for the signals of where the opportunities are to work with the federal government and specifically where to work with the federal agencies that support national security. So we're starting at the top. The biggest and prevailing message that I got out of the State of the Union was focused on Homeland. So let's take a step back here. Homeland is going to be covered by an array of federal agencies, FBI as the senior domestic law enforcement agency. You have other Homeland-ish kind of supporting organizations. I mean, I don't know, you could even throw the FAA in there. But really what he's talking about is the Department of Homeland Security. And then to a lesser degree, the Department of War, who has had an increased size and scope of their role in hemispheric operations, defense of the homeland, which are still very clearly within the rules, regulations, laws, and statute of Title 10, but just used in a way that hasn't been previously used, right? So, going back in multiple presidential administrations on both sides of the aisle, they've used the Department of Defense in their Title 10 capacity in an array of different things, in defense of the homeland or in defense of the hemisphere. It's just this president is using it far more. So where am I seeing the signals coming from the State of the Union? Well, this is where we have to, or not, to your own detriment, divorce yourself from politics and say unemotionally where I want to do business. If you don't want to do business with certain federal agencies, that's on you. Good for you. Tell your investors, tell your stockholders if you have them, and tell your employees that so that they understand that we are not doing certain things. That's CEO 101. Be very clear in your communications to all of your stakeholders so that they understand. But taking that out of the equation, the Department of Homeland Security is going to be the largest federal business opportunity for at least the remaining year of 26, 27, and 28. Now, the reconciliation funds out of the One Big Beautiful Bill go into 29. But that being said, by 29, we could have a Democrat-run House of Representatives and potentially an incoming Democrat president. So the tail end of the reconciliation funds are highly questionable. But what we know is this president and this administration will be here to execute the fiscal year 26, 27, and 28. The largest federal funding opportunity in all things, but predominantly if you're in the tech space, is going to be in the Department of Homeland Security. That's the newest market we have. The Department of War's budget still dwarfs countries by orders of magnitude, but the new and fastest growing opportunities are going to be in the Department of Homeland Security. So where? The Department of Homeland Security is basically the junk drawer of federal agencies. After 9/11, when they structured the Department of Homeland Security, they threw every cat and dog in there. So your major agencies in Department of Homeland Security that you have are CBP, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration or Agency. Don't quote me on that. Secret Service, Coast Guard, and there's another one I'm forgetting. Oh, and TSA, right? So those are the 6 major functions. Obviously, there's others. The Department of Homeland Security is comprised of 22 agencies and sub-agencies, but really those are your big kind of end users. That's where you're going to have your buyers. That's where you're going to have your users. That's where you should engage if you want to deal with that. So the hot areas we know from the president's speech for demand, requirements, focus are going to be CBP. CBP and ICE are it. Now, that's the most politically contentious part of the Department of Homeland Security. Choose to work with them or not, doesn't matter. But technologies that engage in surveillance, detections, indications and warning, drone, counter drone, anything ISR, any software to manage the operations of humans, processing, paperwork, back-end administration, business processes. You have to keep in mind the Department of Homeland Security was stood up after 9/11 and has basically been in a tech deficit for the last however many years that was. I was 25 years, right? Like they haven't had this, Ash Carter, DIU, Valley of Death renaissance in the Department of Homeland Security. For the preponderance of their existence, they've been basically ignored and underfunded. That's changing now, but that opens up a lot of opportunities. Just basic things that probably the Department of War does that we still complain that kind of suck in the Department of War are probably like net new for DHS. So that's going to be anything that has to do anything around border operations, people processing, paperwork, anything like that. Great opportunities. Big in counter drug, counter fentanyl. If you have ways to deal with narcotics, right? So in the latter years of the global war on terror, we started getting all kinds of like cool technologies that were like, oh, this widget will tell you if that white powder is explosives or drugs or what kinds of explosives, so we didn't run into a building and blow ourselves up. It's great. There's a lot of application for that as it transitions into narcotics and narcotics detection, from pre-operation detection to on-site kind of tactical detection. I don't know if anybody has seen this video, but there's tons of them online of when law enforcement officers of every kind. It's not DHS particularly. Sorry. It's not DHS particularly, but like when law enforcement officers encounter large quantities of fentanyl specifically, and because it's such a fine-grained powder, it becomes aerosolized. Just inhaling that will induce an overdose, right? So we have law enforcement officers that are coming in lethal levels of contact with different narcotics, specifically fentanyl. So anything in the world of narcotics detection, narcotics, like I don't know what the right word is. There's a word. It's deactivating. There we go. That's the word. Deactivating the chemicals, right? There's like, you can put different chemical compounds on narcotics to make them inert, right? So you can deactivate them. Anything that you're doing, anything around narcotics, drug detection, drug defeat, like there's an opening. The other hot piece is Coast Guard, right? There is so many analogous relationships to the Coast Guard, to the Navy and the Department of War. Obviously, the Department of War and the president can activate the Coast Guard to be an entity of the Department of War in a time of war. But for the most part, it's managed under the Department of Homeland Security. In these cases, there are analogous organizations. So the Navy just went through restructuring all of their autonomous systems. So let's call it 6 months ago, a year ago. If you had a Group 1 drone, theoretically, you could have a program in Nav Air, Nav Sea, and Nav War. If you sold a drone to the Marine Corps, you were in Nav Air, PMA 263. If you sold a drone that maybe went on to a boat or maybe onto another drone boat, like a USV, you might have had a program in 408. Or 406 or 340, Nav C. Or you could have had a program with Nav War, and you could have been working with SOCOM's element at PEO Maritime or PEO Fixed Wing or PEO Soft Warrior. You see how it gets confusing when you have a giant organization like the Navy that buys for not only the Navy, but they buy for the Marine Corps as well, and their shit's all over the place. So they restructured under a PAE, a Program Acquisition Executive, for robotics and autonomous systems. Now, all of those things, autonomous systems and robotics, and obviously the AI and the software that goes with them, all sit under one house now where they can look at the air platforms, the ground platforms, surface maritime platforms and subsurface maritime platforms all together. I bring that up because the Coast Guard is also starting this office. Okay. In the Coast Guard, you also have a lot of similar mission sets. So you have a lot of same use cases. So if you're already doing business with the Navy, you should be considering doing business with the Coast Guard as long as your thing doesn't kill people, because the Coast Guard doesn't do that. But the biggest tie in here is when the president talks about Golden Dome, defense of the homeland, and Western Hemisphere, the Coast Guard plays a huge part in that. Probably more so under the Golden Dome, defense of the homeland, than the actual Navy would be. So those are the hot areas: border, counter drug, and Coast Guard. Where I see some warm or potential questionable opportunities is probably with FEMA. FEMA's been underinvested in since the beginning. You know, very, very publicly in their early years were criticized for so many things during Katrina. FEMA is on the bubble. There's so much defense tech that could transition there. Different types of ISR, different types of AI for object or human detection, different types of predictive software analytics, different tools for being on the ground, like really high capability but low costs, software defined radios and communication systems. There's a lot from the Department of War that could transition over into FEMA. The question is what's their appetite going to be for onboarding that type of technology, knowing that their funding through reconciliation or One Big Beautiful Bill or OB3 or whatever the hell people call it nowadays is probably limited in time, and the investments in that organization may or may not be there at the end of this, once in a generation level of funding. where I'm just going to go ahead and say it's going to be probably cold is TSA. I'm not going to see, I don't expect a lot of growth in TSA. And I mean, if anybody's been through an airport recently, like Leidos has their logo pasted all over every single thing that TSA makes. I don't see a lot of growth in TSA, and I don't see a lot of opportunities to unseat incumbents. So that is what it is. Here's my sleepers. The sleepers are where I think there's the most growth. In context, they're not going to have Department of War level budgets, but I think there's probably a lot of room for growth here, given the administration, given the president, and given real threats and real technical shortfalls in these organizations. That's Secret Service. We can go back to the assassination attempt in Butler and the succeeding Senate hearings on that, when they defined surveillance, intelligence, and communications as actual technical deficits that led to a lot of the failures there. You got to keep in mind that when Secret Service rolls into an area to do a presidential protection detail, they're having to coordinate and work alongside local police departments, right? These are local sheriffs, local city that, I don't know what the county of Butler's sheriff's department, DIU and USD-R&E, USW-R&E technical acumen looks like, but I'm going to guess they're rolling on Motorola radios and probably some body cams at best. And so like the Secret Service has to roll into these areas on very short notice and set up protection details for the president, use it alongside partners who have none of the capabilities that they probably should, which then creates an opportunity for Secret Service to really just kind of roll with this capability, drop it on whoever they're working with today, and then pack up shop, get out of here, and hit the next town. I see a lot of potential opportunity in Secret Service. And then the other sleeper is CISA. So CISA is the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency. This is national level cyber. This is protection of critical infrastructure. This is digital cyber attacks against the United States, against nation state adversaries. This is OT attacks, right? So as we move into more Internet of Things and everything, to include your stove and your refrigerator and your dishwasher and your home heating system are all attached to the internet now. So I can jump on my app and warm up the house before, I get home because it's freezing here in Northern Virginia. All of those are attack vectors, right? And while my home heating system would be, annoying to get a large bill, I don't know if you could turn on somebody's stove when they're not home for like a week because they're out of town. I don't know, you can cause some real issues. So CISA's got this whole national infrastructure. If you're working anywhere in or around a cyber, OT, critical infrastructure, I mean, even down to like the physical security of critical infrastructure, the logical conclusion past CISA is DOE. All of these are great growth opportunities with a president that, stripping away the politics and the partisanship, is really going to be focused on protection of the homeland, and that includes critical infrastructure, both in the digital and physical sense. So I see Secret Service and CISA as huge growth opportunities in context of how big their budget really could ever get. So bottom line, if you're looking for growth opportunities, these are the areas. We know that the president is driving that, and unlike other administrations that have said things, they've put out national security strategies. The flash to bang between presidential statement, executive order, and then a definitive policy directive or memo from that agency or that executive branch head has been shorter than any time in, I don't know, my living history, where we're seeing the president say, we're going to do Golden Dome or Iron Dome for America. We have a Golden Dome EO that drops weeks later. And at this point, inside the first year, we have a multi-$100 billion MDA Shield IDIQ for Golden Dome. I mean, the opportunity, the flash to bang opportunity, the first time that president said that, to there's actual money on the table. And by the way, that Shield IDIQ has over 1,000 vendors on it, is faster than any time I could ever recall. And if somebody knows a faster time that was not before the establishment of the Department of Defense in the 1946 National Security Act, please let me know. All right. The second big thing that, again, is highly political. We're not doing politics. We're not red. We're not red. We're not. You can cut that. All right. So the next issue that came out of the State of the Union, which is highly political, but here at Last Week in D.C., we are not red. We are not blue. We are green. Where are the opportunities? How do I engage in meaningful ways with my government to assist and enable our nation's security? The president talked a lot about fraud. So now, how or why? Irrelevant. Let's take that out of it. When people say there's too much fraud and it's coming from the executive branch, historically that means cramping down, more policy, more regulation, more compliance, more paperwork. But we're saying this at the same time that our executive branch agencies are moving faster than they ever have. So where's the converging path here? The converging path is, don't let this moment become more paperwork and bureaucracy. If you have systems that create transparency, visibility, accountability, from business software to operational software to processes, procedures, business models, whatever, that can bring the issues that the president has to light in a way that doesn't require additional bureaucracy, you have an opportunity. So I had an opportunity to sit down a few years back when I was working on the Hill with a CEO of one of our major banks. And we were talking about how bad the Department of Defense at the time, DFAS organization, the financial and accounting arm of the Department of, like, where when you're a service member, you get paid out of, how bad their accounting is. Transitioning out of the Marine Corps in the last, 30, 60 days, somebody accidentally hit the wrong button on my out processing paperwork, and I got a bill for like $20,000. And they were like, "We overpaid you. You owe us a check." And I was like, "So I have to pay you to get out of the Marine Corps?" Obviously, it was a clerical error because people are still doing things by hand. When we talked to the president or the CEO of this very large bank, he said, right now you can go into a 7-Eleven, swipe your card, and by the time you get back to your car, you get a text message that says you've made that purchase. We manage trillions of dollars in transactions every single day without any kind of issue. The department should probably have a system like that. So in that sense, obviously DoD audit and DoD financial management is a huge issue. This goes more broadly across the federal government into different benefit programs, into different pass-throughs, into different nonprofits. Obviously, we saw the whole dust up with USAID earlier. Look, I don't care where you fall on the political side of this. If you want more transparency for more financial accountability because you don't want fraud, waste, and abuse to whatever extent that's actually happening, provide transparency. If you want these programs to continue and to exist and not be scapegoated and boogeyman, bring more transparency and accountability so that you can prove and show the validity of these systems and their benefit and impact while finding the things that are wrong with them, thus strengthening those programs. I don't care which way you fall on the political spectrum of what the president said about fraud or waste or abuse. We know the government is bad at processing all of that information. If you have a better way to do it, regardless of a political motive or not, you're going to benefit by engaging in that conversation. So there's that. Final note on that one is keep your shit tight. right? If there's, a witch hunt out there for fraud, waste, and abuse, make sure as a small business, your paperwork is good, your accounting's good, your auditing's good, you're utilizing the tools that the department's leaning towards, i.e. OTAs, CSOs, other mechanisms like that have less accounting and bureaucracy than typical FAR-based contracts, but make sure that if you get called to the table, you have your receipts and you can show that you're acting in the best interest of the U.S. taxpayer. So, final note on that. The other big thing he brought up was tariffs. So now, I don't know if there's a direct opportunity for engagement in tariffs. That's typically high-level trade, and tariffs are high-level economic policy, not necessarily something that, a small business or startup would engage in. But we know that the downstream effects of tariffs for imported goods will drive the price of your products. If your BOM, your bill of materials is mostly non-US components, probably prepare for more price shock as tariffs increase or change or become just more numerous. So price for that volatility. There's a lot of mechanisms when you go into contracting with the government that you can explain and justify pricing of certain items just based on volatility of the market. If in any way, shape, or form that makes any kind of fiscal sense within your business, onshore, buy American, obviously make sure that you're compliant with any buy American statutes and regulations, but more so than that, if it makes economic sense to buy from an American supplier or vendor, you probably should. Just not only because you should support American businesses, but in this administration, your cost of goods are going to go up significantly if this policy of tariff continues. So that's kind of more just be aware that there will be downstream effects. Check your BOM, know what you're bringing to the table, and if you do have those high risk supply chain items, just be transparent with your government sponsors and just let them know. We can't go into all of them here, but there are mechanisms that they can help support that through stockpiling initiatives run out of the Undersecretary of War for Acquisition and Sustainment, Stockpile, Defense Production Act, the Office of Strategic Capital, or an array of other tools that they have that if you are in a critical technology that also has a high risk supply chain, you should be having those communications. So anyway, the other one that I loved, and this is going to be a great opportunity if you know what to do with it. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said basically, if you're a big tech company, get off the grid and start making your own power plants, because the grid is overloaded. The grid is getting too expensive, and AI companies and tech companies, you are consuming a preponderance of the power. Get off the grid. So if you're in predominantly top of mind, if you're in any kind of energy microgrid market, a small modular reactor market, energy storage in different ways, shapes, and forms, you're in a really good spot here to engage as AI and software becomes more of a market, not less, in the War Department. But you go down that supply chain to the people who are doing it, right? The Anthropics of the world and the Palantirs of the world that are getting told to go off the grid. If you're in SMRs or microgrid or energy, you should be going to the biggest users and helping them get off the grid, ipso facto selling shovels and picks to gold miners. The more money they make, the more power they're going to need. Hopefully, then the downstream effect is the more money you make. Now, people outside of that industry, probably obviously not too much, but knowing that specifically the small microreactor, the SMR sector. I guess if you could call it a sector. I think there's only like 4 or 5 companies that really actually do that. But anyways, that whole area and then the ancillary products and services around that are really positioned under this new directive in a very real way that we've seen, nuclear policy come out of EOs. We've seen the rise in interest in companies starting that. But again, flash to bang, I think we'll probably see additional executive orders coming out. I would say it's conservative to say potentially the next 30 days. And then you would have implementation guidance coming after that. You're going to probably see that in Department of Energy. You're probably going to see that in Department of War. So if you're in that sector, obviously that was one of the biggest signals you could ever get from the executive branch and if you're in those tech companies, you got to figure that shit out too. So good luck. I mean, that's a huge signal right from the top that is, again, I don't want to overuse the term unprecedented, but I mean, he gives direction from the top. At least he can't say he's not clear in what he wants. There's no ambiguity with our current president. So really to the heart of it, we saw a lot of statements on the forthcoming $1 trillion defense bill and real focus on NATO cost sharing partnerships and that 5% of GDP NATO requirement for our NATO allies. So, the NATO part, the burden sharing part, that's not new. I think it's a mixed bag right now of what NATO allies are going to focus on creating a domestic industrial base where they are. Obviously, countries like England and Germany already have very robust domestic industrial bases. I don't know what the opportunity there is for, say an American startup to go to one of these countries. Obviously, the NATO Diana program is fully focused on that, is the exchange of not only technology and ideas and companies inside the NATO alliance, but their maybe openness to U.S. startups is going to be varied from an England or a Germany through one of the smaller size, smaller military, smaller version of federal government, smaller budget, smaller GDP kind of countries that probably aren't going to establish their own domestic industrial base, which is where the opportunity is as they have to start spending more of their own money. Nothing about what the president is saying is you have to spend your own money on your own companies. I would argue that he has said in varying ways, you should spend more of your own money on American companies. So that's where the opportunities are. And then obviously the elephant in the room when we talk about NATO is Ukraine. In my anecdotal experience, Ukraine has moved very rapidly towards their own industrial base for the things that they can do. I think it would be a laughable proposition at this point for a new company to bring FPV SUAS Group 1 drone to Ukraine and see any kind of success. But that's not saying that Ukraine doesn't have a need for different or other U.S. based technologies that they can't do there because they're trying to establish their domestic industrial base in the midst of a now 4-year-long war that's depleted them of blood and treasure. So now let's talk about the $1 trillion, I think he even said $1.5 trillion defense budget. We get real nerdy here for a second, so hold on. When we say national security budget, and please, I beg the gods that nobody tries to have a conversation with me today where I have to say this again because it is a very regular occurrence. When we talk about the national security budget, we have to be very precise in what we're talking about. The 050, just Google National Security 050, is the accounting for the totality of the national security budget for the entire federal U.S. government. That includes lines of accounting predominantly in the Department of War, but in most, if not all of the other executive branches. FBI has a play, DHS has a play, DOE. I mean, you look at even just the nuclear portfolio, the Department of War builds and utilizes, well, hopefully not, but theoretically would utilize our nuclear weapons. They're maintained by the Department of Energy, right? So there's a lot of national security in these other federal agencies, and the 050 is the totality of all national security spending. Now, when the president says a $1.5 trillion national security budget, that's not too far off of what we have already, right? The entire 050 for fiscal year 26 was over $1 trillion. Now, if you're talking about the enacted budget for the Department of War at 1.5, we're seeing a roughly $600 billion increase there because last year's enacted defense appropriations bill came across at just over $800 billion. If he's saying 1.5, you're looking at a 40 to 45% increase in the defense appropriation. Now, you're going to say, Mike, I read in the NDAA, stop. The NDAA is not funding. It is policy. It is signaling. It is the armed service committees of the House and the Senate saying, we want to authorize all of this activity, and this is the budget that we need to make that happen. The Appropriations Committee is the one who actually passes our federal budget to be executed in that fiscal year. So the NDAA comes out every year and they have a much bigger number. A $1.5 trillion NDAA looks a lot more like a $1.5 trillion 050 because the things that are under the jurisdiction of the Armed Services Committee in the House and the Senate are different than what's under the jurisdiction of the Appropriations Committees in the House and the Senate. For instance, the Armed Services Committees consider military construction. The Appropriations Committee has its own subcommittee for military construction and Veterans Affairs. The money is in the 050 money is in a lot of different places in the appropriations bill. So I am looking very much forward to the release of the fiscal year 27 president's budget request to Congress that should have been delivered 3 weeks ago in the coming weeks, and seeing what their requested top line is for the Department of War, minus military construction from there, add the intelligence community budget, which you'll never see. That's what we're looking for in appropriations. If that number is $1.5 trillion, giddy up, because that will ostensibly close to double, 45% increase, direct Department of War spending for, or at least have a president's budget request of almost a 45% increase for the Department of War for the following year. Then it's on Congress, the budget committee, to set the 302As of what the top line will actually be to be passed by Congress, and then the 302Bs for the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee. But we'll see. This is like my Christmas, right? Like waiting for the president's budget to come out is basically like my Christmas. So I'm very excited about this. In other news of things that have happened over the last week or so, is the GAO put out a report on continuing resolutions and their impact on the DoD. Save yourself the time. They're bad. No one likes continuing resolutions. But the stoic in me will remind you, we must affect and we must spend mental resources on the things that are within our control. No one other than Congress can make an appropriations bill pass on time and avoid a continuing resolution. We cannot affect that. They're bad. We know they're bad. No new starts, no new funding. We live off previous year's funding. There's all kinds of constraints. We waste money because the obligations and expenditures rules within the department say if you missed a month of spending, that money is going to get reobligated. And at the end of August, we are scrambling to buy dumb shit because that's what we do, because that's the incentive structure that's been put in place. So CRs are bad. Save yourself some time. Don't read that report. Now, a report that you might want to read, and I am going to qualify what I'm going to say coming out of this. The National Academies, all things science, medicine, just put out a report on the SBIR, STTR program and their effects on the Department of War. So I'm going to qualify this. I am 100% not a fan of reauthorization of SIBR in its current form. I was involved in the negotiations of the last SIBR reauthorization. It had problems then. It has problems now. There was supposed to be reform that happened in the years in between out of the Senate Small Business Committee. Senator Joni Ernst and the Small Business Committee put out the Innovate Act that has a very pragmatic set of reforms that should be put in place. And I am a big fan of the Innovate Act. And that's some version of what we need before we should reauthorize SIBR. Mike, we're going to ruin national security if we don't have SIBR. False. And I'm going to tell you all the reasons why. But I wanted to reference the report first. So look, there's really good people on there. I mean, there are really, really great people. Two of them I would like to give a three of them actually I would like to give very explicit acknowledgement of who are on this report. Warren Katz, Nate Diller, and Ellen Lord. Warren Katz has been one of the biggest advocates of the SIBR program and of SIBR reform that exists in the people who speak publicly about these things to varying degrees of effectiveness or competency or competence. Warren is at the top of the heap on this, and he was part of this report, which gives me hope and faith that it is a good report. Nate Diller is a legend. You can look him up. He is currently the CEO of Mach Industries. Prior to that, he was the CEO of Divergent Industries. Prior to that, he worked with me on the House Appropriations Committee. And prior to that, amongst other things, he was the Air Force AFWorks director, which uses SIBR heavily and was basically the architect of TACFI and STRATFI. Nate knows what he's talking about. I like to see him on there. And then Ellen Lord, very famously, was the last Trump administration's Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment and was the chief architect and the amazing human being who got the new adaptive acquisition framework across the finish line so we would stop buying software like aircraft carriers. So these are good people that know their shit that I respect infinitely. But I am always skeptical of reports on SBIR because the sad sack story of America's small business, it's not true. You cannot define a SIBR company as a SIBR company as this monolithic, they're all the same. They are, in fact, not. There are very clearly two camps of SIBR companies. But before we get to the SIBR companies, the most important thing you can ever do when you're going to read a report is look at the methodology and look at the people involved. There are three camps of people involved in this new report. There are your power users. There's a person on this panel that created this study whose company has won over $150 million in SIBR. Okay, that's your user group, and be very aware of their bias towards the benefit of this program to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. We have your reformers, as noted, Warren, Nate, and the Honorable Ellen Lord. And then we have academic skeptics. And there are some individuals on here who have written significant bodies of work on the overall value of SIBR in its intended purpose, right? What does SIBR really do to meet the original intent of the 1982 law? right? The original intent of the 1982 law, paraphrased, but was to stimulate technological innovation, use small businesses to meet federal R&D needs, increase private sector commercialization, and drive economic growth. I don't think anybody's going to argue me on that even not reading the law directly, that's the goal. It's called America's Seed Fund. The whole idea is grow the American economy with more small businesses, because at the time it was even known back then that small businesses are more efficient at doing innovative research and development than big businesses and incumbents and monoliths. But the whole intent was to grow the GDP. You don't grow the GDP by doing endless, never commercialize, never grow and scale RDT&E. The intent is to make more companies, not do more research. We have amazing labs, universities, and FFRDCs and S&T organizations within the Department of Defense like ONR, ARL, AFRL that can do this endless research forever. We need the SBIR program to create new companies. So we know, and this is a fact, come at me, bro. 127 firms win 23% of all total awards. On average of those 127 firms, they average 312 lifetime awards each. In contrast, a non-SIBR abuser has 7. $1.2 million to a non-SIBR abuser, it takes $1.2 million to generate a job. So if you get a $1.2 million SBIR award, you're probably going to hire a human to help you do that new work. As compared, the SIBR abusers, known as the SIBR mills, it takes $2.5 million to create a new job. Why? Because their job is to win these things, do them, and move on. You're not thinking about growing and scaling a company with a new business line. You're just going to do the research that you set out to do in the first place. You don't need to hire somebody until the volume of your SIBRs, because at 1 point or 2.5 million, you would have 2 SIBRs on hand at the same time. You might have to add some more bandwidth, but that's just to do the work until it's done, because the abusers, the mills, have no intent of commercializing or growing or scaling that business. So for every 2.7 billion that has been put out in SIBR, 2.8, well, say that again, over a longitudinal study of 4 years, 2.7 billion that went to SIBR mills converted 2.8 billion in follow-on funding that was not SIBR money. In contrast, a company that is using SIBR correctly with the same 2.7 billion generates 31 billion in non-SIBR revenue, 11 to 1. Out of the SIBR mills, 15% of that follow-on money actually reaches procurement. We are in a day and age where we have a 2027 problem that we have warfighters across the globe who need capabilities in their hands now and at scale, because our adversary, for the first time since the War of 1812, has more people and they have more money than we have. Whether that's dudes holding rifles or people on the shop floor, the Chinese Communist Party is going to outpace us in every way, shape, or form. We need cheap, exploding robots to go fight the fight for us if we are called to task for that. That means things need to get into the warfighter's hands now, today. We need to convert into proc. We don't need more science projects. We have great American companies that have grown over the last 5 years of this new renaissance of startups that have technologies that need to be bought today and put into the hands of the warfighter using procurement dollars at scale in quantity, period, full stop. A 15% conversion in their $2.8 billion of follow-on funding is abysmal, and it's a waste of time. We have a DARPA to do Manhattan Project shit. That's great. Right now, we're in a day and age where we have to put cheap, explodey robots into the Pacific as fast as possible. There's all kinds of things that probably should happen to SIBR. I've been an advocate of the Innovate Act. I've been a fan of caps. I've been a fan of commercialization requirements and strengthening those. Moral of the story is this report identifies all the things that are wrong with the SIBR program, it masks how effective it is by grouping all SIBR companies into some monolith that we very clearly have the data on that are two camps. And for all of the great people involved, their recommendation is further study and understanding of the problem. At this point today, the SBIR program is dead. Given the political dynamic, the idea that even with some type of agreement would be passed on a standalone legislation is probably as DOA as SIBR is right now. We're going to have to wait for NDAA 2027 to see if it gets reauthorized. I have a sneaking suspicion that we have an upcoming midterm election and that the Democrat side of the aisle is going to want to hold that bill, considering how much policy, how much personnel, how much pay, how many aspects of the NDAA that could be political in nature. I think the Democrat Party is probably going to want to hold that bill to wait at least until they see who won the election. And if, and historically based, the House flips as it historically does after a new presidential party takes the administration, the House usually flips in favor of the party that lost the presidential election. We're going to wait until January, February, March next year, then until the new Congress is sworn in potentially to pass the NDAA. So I don't see any other way that SBIR gets reauthorized barring that. So I would just chalk SIBR up to not being a thing for 26 into early 27, and then we'll see what happens. I want to see some reforms. I want to see it going to those companies that get 7 SIBRs or less and turn around an 11% or 11x return on follow-on dollars, become great companies, move on, win AppFits, win other awards, move into procurement, and start delivering capabilities for our warfighters downrange who need as much shit as quickly as possible. But we'll see what happens. I get yelled at a lot for this. Mike, but SIBR, national security. All right, so here's the last note for the day. I sat down this week with the team from Army Fuse, and it pains me to say, as a U.S. Marine, that the Army is doing an amazing job getting after all of the problems that we've seen in small businesses, startups, innovation, adoption. I got a brief this week on the totality of the Army Fuse program. And as somebody who has had the privilege and the pleasure of assisting in acquisition and defense and Department of War reform, this is a great program. It was masterfully created, and the continuum that you're working in can basically throw the last shovel of dirt on top of SBIR because it works absolutely without it. No one in the department lost a single dollar when SIBR went away. They just lost the requirement to fence it or control it for certain purposes went away. Those RDT&E dollars still exist. Moving, as most acquisition offices are, to other transaction authorities make it just as easy to contract. It gives you the same sole source ability. And unlike the problem in an SBIR2 turning into an SBIR3, where you have to have this transition from SBIR dollars into service dollars that are non-SIBR, if you're already working with an organization that has the ability to tap both RDT&E dollars and procurement dollars, think a service acquisition shop, think PAE RAS, PAE Fires, Soft Warrior. They all have 6.4 and proc dollars. If you get a 4022 OTA from one of those organizations, they can convert your prototype OTA into a production OTA, and you're dealing with the same people, different color of money, streamlining your transition. What Army Fuse has put on top of all of that is a beautiful continuation a continuum, if you will, of their programs that do everything everyone needs to. Never in my life would I have said Army, big tanks, big strikers, would lead in innovation, but damn, the Army's doing a hell of a job. So Army Fuse. Army Fuse is explicitly tied in with ARL, the Army Research Lab, and their Army Applications Lab. That's your front end. If you're real early, 6'2", that's where you start. But they have plenty of visibility on what's going on there, and they're explicitly tied through their Army Applications Lab function. Genius. Putting the early money RDT&E with your later money RDT&E, because if you're doing theoretical physics, you're going to want to move into prototyping and demonstration at one point. They've got the viz on that so that they can keep you moving through that process. And then it starts with this thing called an X-Tech. So they're doing these X-Tech competitions. And this is where it gets really nerdy, but if you know, you know. And this could be the biggest. Yeah, I'm going to say that. This is your biggest takeaway from the entire episode. If you write nothing else down, I've hid this to the end so that you keep watching. Not really. It's just by accident, but we're going to go with that. If you win an X-Tech, their awards are from $10,000 to $250,000. If you've already got a couple SIBRs under your belt, maybe you've got a phase 3 transition, maybe you just won, some other kind of award, and you're like, man, I'm not unasking my whole team to go to some place to go maybe get a $10,000 check. All right. Rightfully so. Look, when you look at your pipeline, you got to do pipeline management. You got to do resource management. You got to do troop to task. You're looking at your head counts. You're like, man, I just don't have people to spend the time and effort to get to this thing, to maybe do like a dog. Okay. Got it. I hear you. Here's the genius. This is super nerdy, but it's super important. If you win an X-Tech for that technology and in the scope of that challenge, you've satisfied competition and contracting, and now you're sole sourceable. Mike, SIBR's gone and national security. Stop. The same sole sourceability, the same competition and contracting protections and opportunities that you get out of winning an SBIR phase 1, and you get your like little, couple $100,000 SIBR phase 1 to do a book report. And now you're sole sourceable, and now you've satisfied competition contracting. X-Tech does the same exact thing. Go everywhere that there's an X-Tech, get your $10,000 check, do your little Shark Tank, do your dance, sole sourced, satisfied competition. Boom, foot in the door. Money, such a good move. All right, early scouting. I'll tell you, I can't, obviously protect my sources and methods, but I'm telling you that sometimes people sitting in those crowds on your X-Tech, Shark Tank, they're a lot more important than you think, and they might just show up in civvies and not show up in a uniform, or may not show up in a suit, and they might be sitting in the back watching for some stuff, because I happen to have some friends that got pulled out after their little song and dance, and they said, hey, you should come over here and work with us. If you know, and people are showing up to these things. X-Tech, do it. If you haven't submitted to one, submit to one. If you haven't won one, win one. You want to get your foot in the door in the Army? Get sole sourceable. Get competed. Get your $10,000 check. I don't know. Hopefully they give it to you in like a big cartoon size check, and you can like hang it up on your wall in your office. Like, that's cool. Whatever. All right. Next step. TMI. The Technology Maturation Initiative. All right. So this is like a 6.4 pot, 6.4 RDT&E. Late stage, advanced technology development. This is a lot like USD-R&E's, USW R&E mission capabilities rapid prototyping program. Talk to me about a year or less period of performance where we're going to get your thing out of $6.4 for an investment of about $2 to $15 million, and how we're going to get you out of these RDT&E dollars with one final push, one final sprint, and get you into the proc dollars. Like, let's get this thing commercialized. Let's snap the chalk line on V1, get it done, get it bought in proc. Let's get it out to the field. Let's get it in the hands of the users, because if the balloon goes up today and our warfighters around the world are called to fight tonight, having V1 of your shit rather than waiting around for V 1.1.1.1.8 because you just want to endlessly tinker with your shit doesn't help anyone. Snap the chalk line on V1, get some 6.4 dollars, get some TMI dollars, get your production level proc ready, commercially determined item done, and move it into the next phase and get those proc dollars and start selling things at scale. After your TMI, you're teed up for it. Now you're ready for proc dollars. You're ready for transition into a phase 3 if you had a previous phase 2. All things that you can use here to grow and scale, right? I mean, I don't think anybody from a SIBR mill is going to watch the show to begin with, but if they are, like, these are the behaviors that we want. We want small dollars to go into more dollars, to, you know, everybody out there and their mom wants to be the next Palantir Andrew, right? Get out there and do the damn thing. Grow your business. That happens with proc dollars, not more RDT&E dollars. So these RDT&E dollars get you out of RDT&E dollars rapidly, rapid prototyping, technology maturation initiative. And then on their side, now this is Army side, and in a vehicle that is typically not seen as innovative, but again, the technical and the procedural and the nerdy budget people who put this together, like Chef's Kiss, Mantech. So the Manufacturing and Technology Initiative are large contracts that are run by large primes. Think of like an SAIC or a BAE or General Dynamics or whoever the hell they have on contract today. So it's a prime contract, but they're proc dollars. They're awards from 2 to 25 mil in proc or more. Now you're in the world of the Army's basically got its own outfit. They've got a contract vehicle that's already set up. You finish TMI. They want to put you into low rate initial production. Yeah, maybe you'll get your own contract one day and you'll get your own award. But if you finish TMI tomorrow, do you want to sit around for 2, 3, 6, 12 months to get your own contract so you can be a prime, so you can, you know, I don't know, pat yourself on the back? Or do you want proc dollars today so that I could sub you to a contract, you pay a little bit of a pass-through, and you start producing right now? At the end of the day, if I'm sitting on the investor side of life, yeah, sure, it's cool that you got your own prime contract, but if I got to make the choice that you get your own prime contract a year from now, or you start producing at scale on proc dollars today, that subcontract on a Mantech is ARR today. When I'm looking at investments and valuations and how I'm going to project out what this company's going to do, seeing proc dollars today is a lot better than waiting on proc dollars a year from now, after a CR, after a government shutdown, after a house flip. You see where I'm going here? If you can move into this Mantech line, now knowing that it's attached to this fuse continuum, which is where they're driving all the innovation in the Army from, this really changes the dynamic of how I even think about utilizing that vehicle. So again, all the credit to the guys and gals and the amazing human beings who figured this all out over at Army Fuse. I love when people use things that are already existing and just find creative ways to do them, because using shit that's already legal and authorized is way easier than starting new stuff. And I know that personally. So why is this different, and why is this the last shovel full of dirt on SIBR? Fast contracting. They're using OTAs, 60 days to contract. Soldier touch points. They're not even trying to hear you in Fuse unless you're dealing with the warfighter. Big organizations that are using Fuse, almost the preponderance of the input right now going to Fuse, 3rd ID, 4th ID, 25th ID, 1st Cav, 18th Airborne Corps. I'm sure there are others and everybody could put into it. If your user's not one of them, tell your user, tell your customer, tell your warfighter to engage with Army Fuse. If your customer is one of those groups, tell them to hit the demand signal button and start communicating that. If you haven't won in X Tech, talk to your users, talk to your warfighters. Those organizations are driving the train right now on what the requirements are. And Fuse is a warfighter requirement-driven process. When the folks out at 18th Airborne are like, I need this, that's where you're getting your X-Tech challenge from. That's where you're getting your TMI initiatives from. It's coming from the field. If your warfighter isn't engaging with Fuse, tell them to. If they are, you should be engaging with Fuse so that you can win some of these X-Techs and TMIs, okay? And the genius part of the whole thing is from the Army Applications Lab side through the PAE side, the Fuse team has visibility of where you're going based on the new PAE structure. SIBR never did that because the offices that could issue you SBIR were not linked to the PEOs. So you finished your SIBR, you said, I did everything the government told me to do, and you're having a cold contact with the person who's maybe going to buy your thing if it maybe meets their needs, maybe in 2 to 3 years when they can start palming for it. The Fuse program is tracking your PAE landing pad in advance when you start with the process. They know where you're going. They know where you map to. They know the process. And I'm sure behind the scenes, there's some Sherpa activity of being like, hey, they're getting close. They're getting close. They're getting close. Why do I have the confidence to say that, being that I don't work for Army Fuse, is because the last part of the conversation. The Army Fuse crew is actively engaged with the venture capital community. Now, everyone's engaged with the venture capital community. It's free money. Everybody wants money. Money, 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 money. Give me money. But here's always been my frustration with uninformed investors. I'm not saying that they're doing this because they're malicious or they don't want to know. They just don't. It's just not the world that they come from. Now, there are some really great investors. A lot of tier one investors I spend a lot of time with, and we talk about how to actually do due diligence for the defense sector, right? You know, in commercial due diligence, you're like, oh, I have a thing that goes on people's feet, and there's 1.5 million people in the U.S. military. So I have 3 million customers and my TAM is $1 trillion billion. Give me money. And then they're just blindly handing out $1 million checks to some kids who, I don't know, just rolled off their couch in Palo Alto. That's fine for the commercial world. You waste your money however you want. That's not how that shit works in department. DOD, DOW, federal government, that's just not how it works. Show me where it's in the budget. Because look, unless your founder had $800 million in his pocket and he's going to wait out the monolithic Department of War to change their mind on how they're going to do things, you don't have that kind of runway. Show me where in the Department of War budget today they buy a thing that looks like your thing. Identify the incumbent. Who's the performer there right now? How much is that project or that program worth? That's your real market. Knowing the budget, the program size, the trend over the FIDIP, is this increasing or decreasing? As I look at the whole world and I go, hey, where is the world going? Can I make a predictive assessment of like, is this going to be needed more or less in the out years? But it's all attached to the president's budget request and the congressional enacted appropriations. What does Congress feel about the president's request? There are times that Congress will significantly cut the Department of War request. Track the enacted congressional bills. If you don't know how to do this, sign up for Obvient, right? Like, they don't pay me at all, but I am telling you that if you don't know what I just said, you need an Obvient account. I'm sure it's obvient.com. If they paid me, this would be a commercial, right? I use this regularly, even though I could do this shit on the back of a napkin because it's easier. It makes my life easy. I can just plug the things in. If a company comes to me or a VC comes to me and says, hey, I'm thinking about investing in this company, what do you think their reality of doing business with the Department of War is? First thing I'm doing is I'm going to the enacted appropriations bills and I'm going to the president's budget and I'm looking at the PEOs and the PAs and the PMs who buy this thing, I'm not going off a gut. I'm doing like actual research, and everyone should. So I wrap all that around to say investors are becoming more informed, and the ones that are becoming more informed that I have the great pleasure of working with are doing a phenomenal job at doing real due diligence for the federal and the Department of War sector, as opposed to how everybody else is just doing it for their tactics for doing it for a general commercial market, which are fundamentally different. But Army Fuse, my last note on Army Fuse, if I could, a tear would come to my eye. They are actively engaging with the investment community and saying, hey, here are the companies in our pipeline, and this is their progress, and this is what they're doing, and this is what they've won. And here are the PAs they track to. And if they do this, then that. And if they do this, then that. I could sit here and ramble all day. And fortunately, some people are, silly enough to listen to me. When that same information comes from a .miller or .gov email account and somebody wearing a tree suit, it means a whole hell of a lot more. If an investor's going through due diligence and someone from the Fuse team says, hey, look, this is where they are. This is what they've won. Here's their upcoming events. Here's their upcoming engagements. This is the warfighter they're working with. And if they can land themselves in a PAE, here's the PAE. Here's the CPE they'll work for. Here's the program that they'll go against. And here's the project line that we think that they fit in. And there's a real dollar amount against that. Not only is that incredible due diligence for the investor, but the confidence in that company that is being communicated not only by the part of the Army and the Army Fuse, but to the investor and for that investment into not the dollars, but the company, is a paradigm shift of just guessing who's going to be good and rolling the dice. And then when you're dumb and you don't figure it out, you chalk it up. 1 in 10 is going to make it. Let's do a little better than 1 in 10. I know that this isn't the Herculean efforts of a few individuals. This is a systemic change in the Army in doing things that is explicitly being led by the Secretary of the Army, the head of Army acquisitions, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, ASALT, and the folks they have working around them, and then down to every echelon. This is a top-down systemic change in how the Army is doing business and engaging the communities. And I promised the team there that I'd spend some time talking about this because I live and breathe this shit. We do this all day, every day. And I didn't understand that their continuum was that tight and that plugged in, and that they were doing so much advocacy and engagement. I'm going to say right now that Army Fuse, in my opinion, as of today, is the best system out of all of the services. And I would encourage all the services to look at and figure out what right looks like for them. Because, this goes from 6.2 to PROC, and it's managed by the same organization from beginning to end. That continuity and that awareness through the process is really one of the key antidotes to our Valley of Death problem. So Army Fuse, Army Fuse, Army Fuse. Check it out. Learn more, know more, sell more, do great things for our nation. If you've listened this long, thank you very much. I have mercy on your soul, and I will see you next week.